On the third day of the global blackout, everyone disappeared. They weren't dead or hiding in shelters. I suspect they all went to that world. When I woke up in the hospital, everything was dark. The only light came from the open laptop screen on the bedside table, with a red liquid in a test tube on the keyboard. I put it in my pocket before looking at the content on the screen. The era of global blackout has arrived, and there will be no light in the dark. Just as I finished reading this sentence, the battery of the laptop ran out. My heart was filled with shock and endless panic. 3 years ago, the doomsday prophecy made the whole world go crazy. People were busy stockpiling supplies and building shelters. I thought this so-called prophecy was just scaremongering, but when I woke up, it seemed like the end of the world had arrived. I groped my way to the window, and the world outside was also completely dark. I couldn't see any lights, let alone the moon and stars. It was a dead silence. I huddled in the darkness under the window, and my fear was amplified. Suddenly, there was a burst of urgent footsteps outside the door. I was about to call out, but a scream interrupted me. They were outside my hospital room. The sound of their pain, the sound of their flesh being torn, and the sound of something chewing clearly came from behind the door. My hands and feet were cold. I instinctively held my breath and stared at the door. I had slept in the hospital for too long. What happened to this world? Occasionally, strange howls and the sound of doors being smashed could be heard in the hospital corridor. I heard heavy breathing accompanied by the violent vibration of the chest and the sound of metal equipment clashing on the ground. I stiffened and stayed in the corner all night until a bit of light appeared in the sky. When the sun rose, all the noise outside the door stopped. I slowly stood up and approached the door. The stench became stronger, and black slime seeped into the gap from the door. My heart began to race, and my body instinctively shook. It seemed like a bad choice to go out at this moment, but the empty room wasn't suitable for a long stay. I remembered the supplies I had stored at home. I had to go back. With a burst of courage, I opened the door. The corridor was empty, the stench was gone, and there was no slime at the door, as if I had just imagined it. I walked down the stairs to the first floor. The whole hospital was empty. Panic attacked me again. I ran out of the hospital. As soon as I stepped out of the gate, I was stunned by the scene before me. Everything was shrouded in a gray mist. The whole city seemed to be covered by a huge object, filled with death. Houses collapsed, cars in the street overturned in the greenbelt, the road was dirty and messy, and the wind blew an unpleasant smell. The city under the morning sun seemed to be abandoned, and there was no trace of humans except me. A sense of unease wrapped around me as I slowly moved forward. The dense fog was like an invisible giant hand, tightening its grip on my neck. What happened during the time I was unconscious? What was the meaning of the sentence "era of global blackout" on my laptop? Where did the others go? I arrived home just before noon. There was a disaster notice pasted on the door. Humanity has officially entered the era of global blackout, asking the whole people to unite in this critical moment of life and death. The date was March 16th. I recalled that the date displayed on the laptop yesterday was March 18th, so today was the third day of the global blackout. No. It was 3 years. I tore the notice apart like a madman, reading it repeatedly. I was still in 2019 before I fainted. Had I slept for 3 years? My heart was filled with even greater urgency to know what had happened during the power outage these days, which had turned a city into the current scene. Before I lost consciousness, experts had predicted that the end of the world would come in 2022, causing panic among the entire human race. I remember that before I fainted, I had just finished buying supplies at the supermarket and was on my way home when someone hit me from behind and knocked me unconscious. Then, I seemed to be taken to a room filled with bottles, jars, and various instruments, which seemed like a laboratory. I was injected with something there, and I remember that many things happened later, but those memories were all fragments, and I couldn't piece them together no matter how hard I tried. The memory fragments kept repeating a laboratory, and I had a strong premonition that the once bustling city had become a desolate empty land, and it was probably related to the laboratory in my memory. But where was the laboratory? The world after I regained consciousness was already beyond my understanding, and there were countless puzzles for me to solve. At a loss, I suddenly noticed my notebook, which was quietly placed on the shoe cabinet by the door, covered in a thick layer of dust. I had once had an accident at work and had suffered a significant memory loss, so I had developed the habit of writing things down. Most of the pages were filled with my work and daily logs. Seeing the last page, I couldn't help but feel excited. It was about the survival precautions after waking up. The ink on the notebook was a bit smudged, so it must have been written by me before I fainted. It was now 2020, and I should have been asleep for a long time. If I woke up to any situation, I must remember to go to the laboratory as soon as possible. My eyebrows furrowed, as I had never expected that I would faint 2 years ago. The answers to everything must be in the memories I had forgotten, but the few survival rules on the notebook didn't allow me to think too much. The more I read, the more I felt chills down my spine. Precautions for end-of-the-world survival: there must be enough food at home, a reliable defense system, and try to stay at home as much as possible. The world after waking up is unknown, so it's better to stay at home during the day and return to the hospital at night. The white-skinned species might be of the same kind, and there must be no light at night. Be careful not to disturb them. If you encounter an attack, return to the laboratory immediately and don't trust anyone, not even your own consciousness. They might have gone to that world. I read the survival precautions repeatedly, but the content was quite strange and didn't make any sense. Even if I had written it myself, I couldn't understand what I was thinking when I wrote these precautions. Before I fainted, I must have discovered something and written these words to remind myself. My unconsciousness might be part of a conspiracy. This guess made me realize that my current situation might be even more frightening than I imagined, and I had to find the laboratory as soon as possible. The temperature in the afternoon was much higher, and the thermometer always stayed above 30 degrees. 3 years ago, I had indeed prepared for the end of the world, and the fan at home could barely run with the help of a solar panel. After stuffing some water and food into my backpack, I lay in bed waiting for night to fall. But the day seemed endless, and the sun outside never set. I was a bit drowsy in the stuffy environment until I heard a faint growl, which was the sound of the thing from last night's hospital. I leapt out of bed, flustered, and hid behind the curtains, peeking out. A group of monsters had appeared on the empty street, which was strange. They were tall with emaciated bodies, about 2 meters tall, and their skin was cracked and full of black stuff oozing out. The most important thing was that their skin was grayish-white. I quietly pulled the curtains closed and sat down weakly on the edge of the bed. In the rules, it is mentioned that species with white skin may be of the same kind. Are those monsters outside my window really my kind? There is also a reminder not to disturb them, but who are they referring to? Could they be these monsters? If they refer to the same species, it's not right. I suddenly realized that there seems to be a paradox between the rules. Is there any connection between the rules and these monsters? Why should I stay at home during the day and return to the hospital at night? Is it because these monsters appear at night? But now it's clearly daytime, and my face turned as white as a sheet. I suddenly realized that I seemed to have made a fatal mistake. I must return to the hospital at night. Since all the clocks in my house have broken, I have been waiting for the sunset, intending to leave for the hospital when the sun sets. But I was careless, and the nightfall doesn't depend on when the sun sets. According to the 12-hour system, nighttime is from 7 p.m. to 5 a.m. Although the sun hasn't set yet due to the high temperature, the time may have passed already. Realizing this now is too late, as the monsters have already arrived. I don't know how they sense the presence of humans, through vision, olfaction, or audition. I could feel the eerie screams getting closer and closer. I tried to minimize my presence as much as possible, breathing carefully, hiding in a corner like last night. Dare does not move around. The monsters entered the room downstairs, and they were already very close to me. They seemed to be searching for something, and I could hear things being thrown on the ground. The sound of a glass cup shattering on the ground followed, and the monster's breathing suddenly became rapid, as if it were right next to my ear. A repulsive smell followed, reminiscent of a butcher at a market, with burnt rubber gloves. My head felt swollen, and I accidentally fell off the bed, hitting the bedside lamp, which made a harsh sound. I instinctively looked downstairs and made eye contact with a pair of bright red eyes, and they saw me. I grabbed my backpack and dashed out of the door. The elevator was stopped on the ground floor, so I had to run towards the fire escape. There was a risk of encountering the monsters downstairs. The only way to escape was up, but it was too late. I stood at the entrance of the fire escape, facing the monster climbing up the stairs. It slowly approached me, revealing black rusty teeth. I turned around and ran towards the upper floors. This thing seemed to have a perverse sense of humor, as it always stayed close to me, about a meter away. As I accelerated, it would speed up too, and when I was about to collapse from exhaustion, it would distance apart. The intense running made my brain oxygen-starved, and the pungent, burnt smell of the monster made me almost suffocated. I couldn't stop, I had to live. The monster chased me all the way to the rooftop, and I was trapped in a dead end. My nerves were taut. The monster's hand was thinner than a branch, with dry, tight skin stuck to the bones, and long, sharp nails. I brought my backpack to my chest, preparing for our last stand. But when I was about to launch a counterattack, the monster stopped 1 meter away from me. 88! I stared at the monster in terror. Had I hallucinated? How did the monster know my name? The sun in the sky suddenly began to drink blood, and the sky darkened in an instant. The temperature also began to plummet, and my breath formed water vapor in the air. The heavy darkness pressed down on me, and at this moment, I couldn't see anything. I tried to open my eyes as wide as possible, but it was useless. The unknown amplified my fear, and I didn't dare to move at all. I couldn't feel where the monster that had been chasing me was. Amid the standoff, the cold air continued to erode every inch of the city. The night wind was like a knife that sliced countless tiny wounds on my face, and a thin trail of blood seeped out from them. While I was still guessing the monster's location, the fetid smell engulfed me, and the cold breath blew on my face. There was something sticky and squirming on my wounds, and I was so scared that I didn't dare to move, and my stomach acidity was making me nauseous. There was an invisible suction force holding me back, and it was sucking my blood. My blood was quickly drawn out of my veins, and the pain at the wound became increasingly intense. The process lasted for 2 centuries. Suddenly, a loud boom came from the sky, and the monster's tongue left my face. I finally had a chance to catch my breath. After feeling that my body could move again, I ran towards the direction of the safety channel with all my might. The dark corridor was even more dreadful than the monster. The deathly silence was broken by my footsteps, and I ran crazily. I tripped and fell down the stairs directly. Struggling, I saw the dim light at the exit downstairs. The 2 big characters, first floor in the dim light, glowing with a strange light. I got up, supporting my almost broken body with the wall, and walked towards the exit of the first floor. Just as I turned the corner, despair once again invaded my heart. I had forgotten the rule: no light should exist in the black night. The cold breath once again blew on my back, and a scrawny hand my shoulder. I stiffened and glanced at the numbers posted on the wall in the corner of my eye. I heard my voice breaking in the wind. How could it be? My body was shaking uncontrollably. How could I still be on the first floor? The monster's hand tore my clothes, and the fabric made a hissing sound. I closed my eyes in despair, preparing for the possibility of being torn apart by the monster. But that hand landed on my back, and a huge push sent me flying out of the exit. My body began to plummet rapidly, and the feeling of weightlessness made my heart race. The darkness dispersed, and I was blinded by a blinding white light. I ran in panic through the mist, with chaotic footsteps and various sharp shouts behind me. The forest was a vast expanse of gray, and the remaining color was quickly fading until the last trees green. What was left was gray and white, and the mist finally dissipated. But I couldn't move anymore. I was surrounded by monsters. Their faces were white with fright, and the cracks seemed to cut their faces into countless pieces. Dozens of swollen eyes were staring at me intently. Their corners were stained with a bloody stiff smile. Out! Out! They surrounded me, and all the monsters were yelling at me. I crouched on the ground in despair, feeling these things gradually approaching and extending their hands. I screamed and opened my eyes. There was a cold sweat on my forehead. It was just a dream, and I breathed a sigh of relief. Looking around, the fear in my heart surged again. I was still in the dream just now. Everything I could see was gray and white. The sky was white, the trees were white, and the ground under my feet was a vast expanse of white. No, this wasn't a dream. I noticed that everything around me was too strange, and the only normal thing seemed to be myself. Suddenly, a low and shallow singing echoed through the forest, a chanting sound ethereal and devout, which made people feel reverent. I was attracted and walked towards the sound. I had never imagined that I would see such a terrifying scene. Have you ever seen things with strange shapes, like devout believers, kneeling on the ground? I have. I looked at the scene in front of me with a dead expression. All the monsters sat in a circle, all of them with their hands down, kneeling in front of a statue of a human figure. They recited in unison, as if they were the sincerest believers in the world. From my perspective, I couldn't see the front of the statue. I looked at the fire in the middle of the monsters, which was burning fiercely. The gray flames seemed to be screaming and hysterically crying. A voice in my heart told me firmly what was happening. My mind flashed with memories, but I couldn't catch anything. I slowly approached the place where the monsters were, wanting to find out the truth. I didn't take 2 steps when I stepped on a broken book, a guide to survival in the end of the world. I flipped through the first page of the guide, and someone had written a sentence in the blank space. The writing was so messy that I couldn't quite understand the second sentence. God can bless, but what? Who is this so-called God? My heart sank deeper and deeper. A huge net spread out in front of me, but I couldn't even untie the simplest knot. I guessed that these monsters might be worshipping this. A suspicion crept into my heart. I was pushed into this strange white space by the monsters. The monsters were white, so this must be their lair. What could it protect or bestow on these monsters? Perhaps it was inseparable from the laboratory? After a thorough analysis, I became more and more convinced that my suspicion was correct, and I had a new direction. The singing of the monsters had not stopped, ethereal and a bit trembling. It was like a spell. My head was splitting. A strong wind blew, and the desert sand blew the survival guide that had fallen to the ground, flipping through it. The wind didn't stop, but the book stopped in an extremely bizarre shape. I opened my eyes in the wind and sand and saw a page that I had not seen before in the book. It was the end of the world survival precautions, which were almost the same as those in my notebook. The wind resistance was great, and I grabbed the corner of the book with great effort. The wind and sand dispersed, and everything returned to normal. There was only one rule in the book, different from my notebook: don't believe anyone, not even your own consciousness. You can believe the white-skinned species, but be careful to identify the only trustworthy one. I instinctively looked up, and unexpectedly locked eyes with a monster who was praying. I was discovered. Would he be the only one I could believe? My mind quickly judged the 2 rules, which one was true, and which one was false. Suddenly, I found myself in the lobby of a hospital. I was back. No, everything here was still gray and white. I was still trapped in the previous ghost place. Go to the ward, a low and hoarse voice echoed in the lobby. I looked around. Who are you? The voice didn't answer me, but urgently urged me, shouting, run. Suddenly, everything in front of me changed quickly. The originally clean and tidy lobby was in chaos. There were bodies in the corners. The hospital was full of bloodstains. The glass, the floor, the walls were all dark red bloodstains. The panting sound of the monsters came from the distance. I could still hear the chanting of the gods. The monster was about to arrive, and I finally came to my senses after the scare, quickly running to the 5th floor. The hospital corridor was already filled with people lying in all directions, and on my way to my ward, there were 2 monsters wielding medical equipment and randomly smashing them. I hid in the nurse's station, carefully sticking to the wall. Suddenly, a monster roared in anger, and I peeked out to see that another monster, even larger in size, was pressing the two under its body. For the first time, I deeply understood what it meant to be the weakest meat and the strongest predator, which was absolute power. Those two monsters that terrified me were like two pieces of torn cloth being easily shredded by the stronger one, their bodies thrown away and heavily hitting the door. The giant monster approached the door, just grasping the handle when it suddenly cried in pain, taking a big step back. Fortunately, this monster didn't stay here for long, and it left soon. The fighting and shouting soon spread to other floors, and I quickly went forward to investigate. The room that the monsters couldn't open was the one I used to live in, which excited me. I was sure that my ward was special. I understood why the hospital was a haven in the survival rules of the end, return to the hospital at night. In an instant, everything disappeared as I wanted to enter my ward. I was still lying in the grass, and the monster's eyes were still staring at me. It was special and stood out in the crowd of monsters. It was much taller than the others, which was the one I had seen in the hospital before. Could everything I had just experienced be deliberately shown to me by that monster? It stood up, and with each step, the ground shook. I watched it get closer and closer to me, wanting to run, when suddenly it got dark, and I was once again completely controlled by that mysterious force. I watched the monster approach me, holding me in its hand, and it looked closely at me. The protruding eyeballs swelled a little more, becoming even redder. There, I saw myself locked in an iron cage, and a raging mountain fire. When I wanted to explore more, all the pictures stopped suddenly. In an instant, the eyes were full of red blood vessels, staring at me with a tight grip. At this moment, I was no longer afraid, and I could believe in the white-skinned species. I could trust him, I asked myself. In the dark, I felt a gust of wind, which gently brushed over my head. I don't know how long it took before he finally put me down on the ground. When the sky brightened again, I was already at home, and everything around me had returned to normal, and the monsters were gone. The sun outside was just a faint glow, and the sunlight dragged a long shadow on the dirty and messy street. I set off for the hospital in the setting sun, but when I rushed up the stairs, I couldn't find the entrance to the building. It was the same as before when I was trapped, and the red marks on the railing gradually appeared as time went on. I finally understood. What did it mean to return to the hospital at night in the rules? Exactly, to return to the ward in the hospital. The tranquility of the day was just an illusion, and only when night fell would all the tragedies hidden under the sun be revealed. Day and night were like some kind of cycle. More and more people appeared around me, all wearing pure white hospital gowns. Some were lying in the corners and on the stairs, their whole bodies stained with blood, without any life. Others walked past me in a daze, muttering out softly. The familiar chanting sound resounded, and I saw the cracks in their expressions. Everyone began to panic and ran upstairs. I followed them until the end of the stairs, where a dim light appeared. Should I go in or not? After a moment of dazzling white, I didn't end up in the white world I thought I would, and the people there disappeared. Everything became quiet again. I found the 5th floor. I excitedly took a few steps forward, but the scene in front of me changed rapidly, switching between the white world and the real world, like a faulty light bulb constantly flickering. I tried to take a few more steps forward, and finally confirmed the rule for switching between the two worlds, which seemed to be 1 step per world. That is, when I arrived at the ward, I had to make sure I was in the real world. I thought this was a simple matter, but when I found that the white world and the real world were simultaneously filled with the panting sounds of the monsters, everything got out of hand. They were so close that I couldn't inch forward, so I ran out as fast as I could, struggling forward in the two different worlds. In the blinding white, a ferocious monster was closely following me, and every step I took in the real world was almost instantaneous, while in the white world, I wished I could fly every step I took. In the white world, I seemed to fly, leaving the monster far behind. But when I reached out to the door handle of the ward, the world froze, and my world finally stopped at a white void. Right when I was about to open the door, my legs were grabbed by 2 strong hands, which dragged me back heavily. The white world disappeared, and I fell to the ground. Standing in front of me was the largest monster of them all. I stared at him intently, not because I was afraid, but because I had discovered a black symbol on the inside of his arm. Was this monster the so-called ruler? This seemed to make sense, as this guy was the most special of all the monsters. He didn't seem to have any intention of hurting me, and there was a glint of water in his hateful eyes. I tried to talk to him. Do you know the laboratory? After he gave me a positive answer, I almost jumped up from the ground. At that moment, the originally quiet surroundings were filled with heavy panting sounds, and other monsters who had arrived sometime earlier were staring at me with excitement, as if they had just discovered their prey. The monster in front of me grabbed me directly, pulled open the door of the ward, and there was a sizzling sound when my skin touched the door handle. Opening the door seemed to be a painful thing for him. With every degree the door handle went down, I could clearly hear his flesh tearing. Finally, he opened the door and threw me inside, followed by the deafening sound of the door closing. I was shaken, sat on the ground, and heard the intense fighting and growling outside. He was going to be torn apart by them. Just as I was at a loss, a familiar voice came from behind, "You can't save him." I looked back in terror, taking a few steps back. There was a person who looked exactly like me. No, it was me. He didn't care about my reaction, but went to the door and pressed a switch. The lights flickered a few times, and the ward turned into another place. Electricity was available here. In addition to being shocked, I started to examine the interior layout. There were various bottles and jars on the table, a huge screen with countless red dots on it, as if it was detecting something. This was clearly the laboratory I remembered, and my question was finally answered. Rule: if you encounter an attack, return to the laboratory immediately. The reason why the ward is a safe house is that the laboratory is hidden inside the ward. I watched another me busy in the laboratory, occasionally typing something into the computer. I couldn't help but ask, what is going on? What are those monsters? Where did the others go? I didn't even raise my head. This is the apocalyptic world you set up, isn't it? The apocalyptic world I set up. I don't understand. I muttered with a smile. I had forgotten, you replaced your own memories. I saw that smiling face looking at me. Do you want to change your memories back? Before I could answer, I saw him press a button on the control panel, and a current started flowing through my entire body from the soles of my feet. Everyone will go to that world, and in my memories, I was wearing a white coat, standing in front of everyone, getting used to the apocalypse as the last hope for humanity. The scene shifted, and I saw the laboratory destroyed beyond recognition, still standing in the same place, surrounded by people in white coats. Simulating the apocalypse is wrong. We must stop this. How can we stop it? I stood in front of the display screen, watching the people on the screen either die or become monsters in pain. I still firmly believed that we had to end this absurd experiment. I was one of the initiators of the so-called New Human Project, but it was also me who wanted to end the plan earliest. In order to adapt to the apocalyptic environment in the future, my team and I developed a coolant to change the function of the human body. However, as the apocalyptic simulation experiment went on, I gradually realized how foolish this plan was. The side effects of the coolant were too terrible, but I discovered it too late. The coolant for the experimental subjects was stolen and sold by the laboratory staff, and the extreme heat had already driven many people crazy. The coolant that allowed the body to adapt to high temperatures was like a miracle drug, and people were desperate to get it. Those who injected the coolant all became monsters that had to feed on their own kind to survive. My colleagues made a fortune from the coolant and even began to describe the simulated apocalypse as a utopia, luring countless people to join the New Human Project. The coolant was like a kind of control agent, and humans would gradually lose their self-awareness until they became completely monstrous. The only way to save them was to enter the simulated apocalypse, find someone who had not been controlled by the coolant, and take their blood samples to develop a cure for the coolant. At the end of my memory, I saw myself solemnly putting the notebook on the shoe cabinet. I met a human who could maintain his self-awareness in the simulated apocalypse soon after I entered. His name was Li Chen, and of course, he eventually became a monster too. But thankfully, his self-awareness never left him. I secretly took his blood sample before she left and wrote a mark on his arm, so that giant monster was Li Chen who saved me in the simulated apocalypse. He had always had self-awareness, which was why he had thrown me into the laboratory without hesitation. But what did the ruler of the world mean? I smiled and pressed another button on the panel. A glowing door appeared at the front of the laboratory. If you want to know the answer, go and see for yourself. I walked step by step towards the door, and just as I was about to step through, I backed away. Do not trust anyone, not even your own consciousness. I looked back at the smiling me with a guess. The monster was not actually Li Chen, but you, right? The missing memories were actually you take over my body and going out to move around. I was certain about it. My face turned pale instantly, and the smile on my lips became ugly. I didn't know where the person who looked exactly like me had come from, but I was certain that he had been operating everything in the laboratory during the time I was in the simulated end of the world, so the manipulator was also the master. I looked at him firmly, and a smile identical to his appeared on my lips. You want to replace me, don't you? My smile on my face became bigger and bigger as I furrowed my brow and looked at him. He was a bit confused. At this moment, I suddenly noticed that his hand had touched another white button. I couldn't stop him in time, and the vision before my eyes suddenly turned black. Everything collapsed silently, and my body fell rapidly. Someone patted my arm and whispered in my ear. It was just a momentary touch, but it quickly disappeared. The sound still lingered in the air. In my laughter, I finally landed. My body rolled on the ground several times. The white road, white trees, and everything else were back here. The singing voice still came from the woods. The monsters, or rather, the people who had mutated, were all sitting in front of the idol, prostrating themselves before it. This time, I clearly heard their chants. Go out! Go out! I was looking at it when the singing suddenly stopped, and the sound of terrible howls followed. My body couldn't help but tremble. The idol moved. It was so vividly and intricately carved that its neck began to mysteriously turn in the deafening screams. I saw the face of this idol for the first time. My vision was gradually reduced to white, and the face of the idol became just an outline. In the blur, I could see that face with its mouth wide open, smiling at me, and then rushing towards me. I ran and struggled, but the face was too fast. It finally pressed tightly against mine. The face under the skin had countless tendrils, which penetrated my pores and rooted themselves. I could clearly feel something moving rapidly inside my body. They became more and more numerous, larger and larger, and frantically swallowed. My body dried up rapidly, and I cried out in pain. In my mind, I could see my own appearance clearly. It was so revolting, with my white skin splitting open, and the veins on my face standing out. The wounds were slightly moving. How could I become one of those monsters? I grabbed the face skin painfully, trying to tear it off. The harder I pulled, the more thoroughly the face skin merged with me. Until my whole body became like those injected with the cooling fluid, all the pain stopped. I looked up and saw that I had become a monster. He easily caught me and lifted me up. In his eyes, my appearance had not changed at all. I didn't become a monster. But just as I was delighted, a sentence like a bucket of cold water poured directly on me. Don't you understand? His eyes were full of mockery. I am you, and you are me. How is that possible? My gaze was transfixed as I watched his body being lifted into the air by some mysterious force at that moment. My body began to gradually become transparent, and eventually turned into a white mass of fog. Suddenly, I was thrown heavily to the ground, and my gaze fell on the eyes of the statue of the god. I am the god of this world. After the white fog merged with me, I gained complete memory. All the cognition I had built before was shattered at this moment. I was not the initiator of the New Human Project, but the first successful experimental subject, with the codename 8. I was the only one with self-awareness among all the experimental subjects before the simulation of the end of the world. I hated the experts who turned me into a monster. On the second day after my mutation, I had torn them all apart. By chance, I found a tube of separator drug in the laboratory, which separated the mutants on my body. After that, I discovered the formula of the separator. To successfully separate the mutants from the body, the blood of the successful subject was needed as a drug. I chose to go alone to the simulation of the end of the world filled with mutants to find the successful samples with self-awareness. Things were going well at first, but what I didn't expect was that my mutant had also gained self-awareness. I deliberately destroyed the order of the end of the world in the laboratory, and the failed products from the simulation world returned to the real world in large numbers. They went crazy, destroying everything on Earth and wasting countless non-renewable resources. The end of the world came early. I am filled with despair and pain because of all the memories I possess. In a sense, the lifeless scene in the world today is a result of my own doing. The mutated me relies on the laboratory to control almost all the monsters. Every night, I would release all the failures in the simulation world to come to the real world, and during the day, I would lock them back up in the simulation apocalypse. Due to improper operation, the simulation apocalypse was reduced to nothing, leaving only the original white space. Reality and the simulation world began to overlap, and the space would suddenly interweave at certain times. Those failures prayed for me to set them free every day, seeing me as the all-powerful God. This memory is undoubtedly a devastating blow to me. I had wanted to obtain the medicine to save everyone, but in the end, I became the one who destroyed everything. 8. Are you not happy? I suddenly appeared in his mind, and he was looking at me with malice. Let's become gods for everyone together, his voice echoed, full of temptation. That's not right, I gasped, struggling to speak each word firmly. What is God? My eyes became lost, and then I heard his joyful voice, God can dominate the world. You're wrong, I said. Nobody can be the master of the world. He roared in anger. The door to the laboratory was suddenly knocked on. I opened the door to find a towering mutant standing outside. It was Li Chen, and I smiled and invited him into the laboratory to help me with the final experiment. When the new separation agent was injected into Li Chen's body, I saw a pair of giant hands covering my mouth as I screamed. I told him that humans are the only ones who can be their own masters. Several months later, the rain bombs containing the separation agent successfully exploded over the city. Li Chen and I stood on the rooftop of the hospital, watching the pouring rain in silence. This absurd experiment on the new human race had finally come to an end. Next was the reconstruction of the city. The sun broke through the clouds, and a faint rainbow arched over the city. When I looked at Li Chen, I found him still frowning. What's the matter? He shook his head, his deep eyes fixed on the brilliant colors in the sky. After a long time, I heard his voice, heavy with anxiety, what about our current world? Li Chen looked into my eyes and sighed, could our current world be a higher dimensional laboratory? With that, a thunderclap resounded in the sky, and the clouds gathered around the sun once more.